The sun over Altus, Oklahoma on April 9, 1947 started as any other spring morning. It rose warm and golden, casting long shadows across the flat fields of wheat and cotton that stretched for miles in every direction. The town itself was small, a place where everybody knew everybody else, where the main street was lined with brick storefronts and the biggest building in town was the courthouse. Folks went about their business that Wednesday morning without a hint of the terror that was gathering on the horizon. The air felt thick, heavy, like a wet blanket draped over the land. Farmers checked the sky and frowned, recalling old sayings about green clouds and still air. But no one truly believed that anything out of the ordinary would happen. Not here, not today. By mid-afternoon, the temperature had climbed into the high 70s, and the humidity made every breath feel like a sip of warm soup. Children had been let out of school at the usual time, and they ran home along dusty roads, kicking up puffs of red dirt. Downtown, the drugstore was busy with people picking up prescriptions and buying bottles of soda. The hardware store had a few customers looking at new plow blades. At the railroad depot, the 315 freight train from Lawton had just pulled in, and the station master, a lean man named Roy Bell, was checking his pocket watch and making notes in a ledger. Everything seemed normal, everything seemed safe. Then the wind changed. It was subtle at first, a shift from a gentle southern breeze to a strange, uneasy stillness. The leaves on the pecan trees along Main Street hung limp and motionless. Dogs started whining, pressing themselves low to the ground. Birds that had been chattering in the bushes went silent. People noticed, but they didn't know what to make of it. Some said later that the air felt electric, like the moment before a thunderstorm, but heavier, darker, more threatening. The sky to the west began to take on a sickly greenish tint, a color that old-timers knew meant trouble. Farmers hurried to herd their cattle into barns. Mothers called their children inside. But for many, it was already too late. At 4:30 p.m., the first tornado warnings came in over the telephone lines. The Weather Bureau in Oklahoma City had spotted a massive thunderhead forming over the Texas Panhandle, and it was moving east at a frightening speed. The word went out to sheriff's offices and radio stations across western Oklahoma. In Altus, the town's only radio announcer, a young man named Pete Johnson, cut into the regular broadcast with an urgent message. He said a funnel cloud had been sighted near the Red River, heading straight toward Jackson County. He told everyone to take cover immediately. His voice trembled as he spoke because he knew what was coming. He had seen tornadoes before, but nothing like this. The storm system that spawned the Altus tornado was a monster. It was what meteorologists would later call a supercell, a rotating thunderstorm with a life of its own. It had already produced a devastating tornado in the town of Glacier, Texas, and another in Higgins, Texas, before crossing into Oklahoma. By the time it reached the outskirts of Altus, the tornado was a mile wide. A black column of churning debris that looked like a living thing, a twisting, roaring beast that ate everything in its path. Eyewitnesses who saw it from a distance said it seemed to touch the sky and the ground at the same time, a dark rope connecting heaven and earth. The sound was indescribable. Some said it was like 1,000 freight trains. Others said it was like the roar of a waterfall, but deeper, more primal, and it was growing louder by the second. In the small house on East Commerce Street, a woman named Leila Mee Harris was putting the finishing touches on a chocolate pie for dinner. Her husband, Tom, was not home yet. He worked at the grain elevator on the south side of town, and she expected him any minute. Her two children, Billy, age 7, and Susie, age 5, were playing on the living room floor with a set of wooden blocks. The radio was playing music, but then Pete Johnson's voice broke through, urgent and shaking. Leila Mee froze. She had heard stories about tornadoes all her life, but she had never seen one. She moved to the front window and looked west. The sky had turned black, and she could see something huge and dark spinning toward the town. Her heart began to pound. She grabbed the children and ran for the cellar door, but it was stuck. The wood had swollen from the humidity. She pulled with all her strength, but it would not budge. Billy was crying. Susie was clinging to her leg. The roar was getting louder, and the whole house seemed to vibrate. Meanwhile, at the grain elevator, Tom Harris saw the tornado coming. He yelled for the other men to take cover. They scrambled toward the concrete foundation of the elevator, diving into a narrow crawl space as the wind hit. Tom looked back over his shoulder and saw his house 2 blocks away still standing. He prayed his family was safe. Then the tornado struck the grain elevator. The building was steel and concrete, one of the strongest structures in town, but the tornado did not care. It ripped the roof off like a child tearing the lid off a cardboard box. The walls buckled inward. Tom felt himself lifted off the ground, thrown against a pile of grain sacks. The air was full of dust and pieces of metal. He could not see, could not breathe. He thought he was going to die. In the downtown area, the tornado hit the courthouse square with devastating force. The courthouse was a 2-story brick building with a clock tower, a landmark that had stood for 40 years. The tornado took the clock tower first, twisting it like a corkscrew and hurling it into the street. Then it tore the roof off the building and tossed it into the park across the street. The old pecan trees along Main Street were snapped in half or uprooted entirely. Cars were lifted and thrown into storefronts. The drugstore collapsed, burying the pharmacist and several customers under a pile of bricks and glass. The hardware store was flattened. The railroad depot was ripped apart and the freight train that had arrived just minutes earlier was overturned, its heavy cars tumbling like toys. Roy Bell, the station master, was never found. The tornado moved through the heart of Altus in less than 2 minutes. 2 minutes, that was all it took to turn a peaceful town into a wasteland. Homes were reduced to piles of kindling. Churches lost their spires. The high school gymnasium, where the basketball team had practiced just the night before, was swept clean off its foundation. 50 people died in those 2 minutes. More than 300 were injured. And the survivors, those who crawled out of basements and cellars and bathtubs, emerged into a world that no longer looked like home. Leila Mee Harris never made it to the cellar. When the tornado hit her house, she threw herself over her children, covering them with her body. The roof was torn away, the walls collapsed, something heavy struck her in the head, and the last thing she saw was the sky churning and black through a gap in the ceiling. She thought of Tom, she thought of her mother, then everything went dark. When she woke, she was lying in the open with broken boards across her legs. The house was gone. Beside her, Billy was crying, but he was alive. Susie was not moving. Leila Mee screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the wind that was still howling, though the worst had passed. The tornado continued east, leaving Altus behind and tearing through fields and farms, finally lifting near the town of Mangum, 20 miles away. When it was over, the path of destruction was nearly 2 miles wide and 30 miles long. In Altus, the sky began to clear, and the sun came out again, shining on a scene of utter devastation. Rescue workers from nearby towns arrived within hours. They brought shovels, blankets, and medical supplies. They dug through the rubble with their bare hands, pulling out the living and the dead. The Red Cross set up a temporary hospital in the school that had been spared. The National Guard was called in to maintain order and prevent looting. The governor declared Jackson County a disaster area, but none of that mattered to the people who had lost everything. In the days that followed, the people of Altus began to rebuild. They were stubborn, tough, proud. They had been through dust storms and droughts and depressions. They had survived. This was just another blow, and they would rise again. But the memory of that day, April 9, 1947, would never leave them. The sound of the wind, the sight of the black funnel, the smell of wet earth and splintered wood, it was etched into their bones, passed down to their children and their grandchildren. Even today, when the sky turns green over Altus, Oklahoma, the old folks look up and remember, and they pray that it never happens again. The recovery effort was massive. Tents were set up in the city park to shelter the homeless. Food trucks came from as far away as Oklahoma City. Volunteers from churches and civic groups poured in, offering whatever help they could. The Red Cross reported that over 600 families were left without homes. The property damage was estimated at more than $5 million, a staggering sum for a small agricultural town, but the real cost was measured in loss. 50 lives, hundreds of injuries, families torn apart. The Harris family was one of the lucky ones. Leila Mee survived, though she suffered a broken arm and a concussion. Billy had a few cuts and bruises. Susie had a fractured leg, but she would heal. Tom was found at the grain elevator, unconscious but alive. When he woke up in the makeshift hospital, the first thing he asked about was his wife and children. He wept when he heard they were okay. The story of the Altus tornado is not just about destruction. It is about human courage. It is about the man who ran into a burning house to save a neighbor's baby. It is about the woman who used her own body to shield her children from falling debris. It is about the doctor who worked for 36 hours straight, treating the wounded with no sleep. It is about the strangers who arrived with shovels and water and hope. That is what the people of Altus remember, not the terror of the storm, but the kindness that followed. This is the story of that day. This is the story of the Altus tornado, and this is only the beginning. The storm had passed, but the real work was just starting. The survivors had to find a way to go on. They had to rebuild not just their homes, but their lives, and they had to face the long, hard road ahead. The sun was setting over the ruins of Altus, Oklahoma, and the night was cold and dark. But tomorrow would come, it always does. And with it, a new chapter in the history of a town that refused to die. In the days after the tornado, Altus became a place of strange silence. The constant hum of everyday life had been replaced by the sound of hammers and saws, of trucks grinding over debris, of voices calling out names in the rubble. The air still smelled like wet plaster and splintered wood, and every now and then a gust of wind would stir up a cloud of dust that made people flinch. They had grown afraid of the wind. Even a light breeze could send a shiver down the spine of the toughest farmer. Children cried when the sky darkened, and many adults found themselves looking over their shoulders, scanning the horizon for a funnel that might not come for years but would never be forgotten. Leela Mee Harris lay in a cot at the temporary hospital, her arm in a sling, her head wrapped in bandages. She could barely move, but her eyes were fixed on the two small cots beside her. Billy was sleeping, his face smudged with dirt, a bandage on his cheek where a piece of glass had cut him. Susie was awake, staring at the ceiling, her leg in a cast. She was only 5 years old, but something in her eyes had aged. She did not speak much, just watched the nurses come and go. Leela Mee reached out with her good hand and touched Susie's arm. The little girl turned her head and looked at her mother. She did not smile. She just looked, and then she closed her eyes. Leela Mee knew that look. It was the look of a child who had seen too much. She prayed that Susie would one day forget the sound of the house collapsing around them, the feel of her mother's body pressed against her, the weight of the darkness. Tom Harris was in another part of the hospital, his ribs bruised, his shoulder dislocated. He had been pulled from the rubble of the grain elevator, half buried under sacks of wheat. He was lucky, the doctor said. A few inches to the left and he would have been crushed by a falling beam. Tom did not feel lucky. He felt hollow. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the tornado bearing down on the town, and he heard the screams of the men who had not made it. Two of his coworkers were dead, one was missing. Tom had known them for years, shared meals with them, argued about baseball with them. Now they were gone, and he was lying in a bed with a bandaged shoulder, thinking about how he had not been able to save them. The days blurred together. Rescue workers kept arriving from other towns, some driving for hours, some coming by train. The railroad had been damaged, but the tracks were cleared within a week, and supplies began to flow in. The Red Cross set up a distribution center in what was left of the courthouse square. The courthouse itself was a skeleton, its clock tower gone, its walls cracked, its windows shattered. But the flagpole still stood, and someone had tied a new American flag to it. It fluttered in the breeze, a small symbol of defiance. The people of Altus started to organize. They held meetings in the open air, gathering under a tent that had been donated by a church in Lawton. They elected a committee to oversee the rebuilding. Someone suggested that they should move the town, start fresh somewhere else. But the motion was voted down almost immediately. This was their home. The land held their dead, their memories, their history. They would rebuild where they stood, and rebuild they did. The first priority was shelter. Families who had lost everything were given tents and tarps, but the nights were still cold in early April. The temperature dropped into the 40s and people huddled together for warmth. The Red Cross brought in blankets and cots, and the Army sent in field kitchens. Hot meals were served 3 times a day, and the lines stretched for blocks. People waited patiently, some with children in their arms, some with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They did not complain. They were alive, and that was enough. The second priority was clearing the debris. Every available man, woman, and teenager was put to work. They formed bucket brigades, passing debris from hand to hand. They used horses and mules to pull wreckage out of the streets. They burned what could be burned and buried what could not. It was slow, back-breaking work. The sun beat down during the day and the dust choked their lungs. But they kept going. They had to. There was no other choice. One of the first buildings to go up was a temporary school. The old high school was gone, but the elementary school had survived with only minor damage. The teachers gathered the children in the surviving classrooms and did their best to maintain some sense of normalcy. They taught lessons, organized games, and tried to keep the kids from talking about the tornado, but the children talked about it anyway. They drew pictures of black funnels and falling houses. They played storm in the playground, spinning and screaming until a teacher made them stop. Susie Harris went back to school a week after the tornado. She walked with a limp, her leg still in a cast, but she insisted on going. Leela Mee walked her to the door every morning, and every morning Susie looked at the sky before she went inside. She would stand there for a moment, her head tilted, her eyes scanning the horizon. Then she would go in, and Leela Mee would watch her until she disappeared into the building. It broke Leela Mee's heart to see her daughter so wary, so watchful. But she knew that time would heal. It had to. The rebuilding of Altus took years. The first structures were temporary, but the people had long memories and they built to last. They poured concrete and laid brick. They raised new houses on the same foundations, using the same layouts as if to prove that nothing could drive them away. The grain elevator was rebuilt, stronger and taller than before. The courthouse got a new clock tower, and the clock was set to the exact time of the tornado, 6:32 p.m., as a memorial to those who had died. Every year on April 9th, the clock would chime at that hour and the town would stop and remember. But the scars ran deeper than the physical. Men who had survived the storm found themselves unable to sleep. They would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, hearing the roar. Some turned to drink, some turned to the church. The pastor of the First Methodist Church, a man named Reverend John Aldridge, had lost his own home and his congregation. He spent his days walking through the ruins, offering prayers and comfort. He held services in the open air under a canvas tent, and the pews were filled with people who had never been to church before. They were searching for something, some meaning in the chaos, some reason to keep going. Reverend Aldridge told them that the Lord had not abandoned them. He told them that the storm was a test and that they would pass it if they held on to their faith. Many believed him, many did not. But they came anyway because there was nowhere else to go. The Harris family slowly put their lives back together. Tom found work with a construction crew helping to rebuild the homes of others. He would come home every evening exhausted, his hands blistered, but he never complained. He was grateful for the work. It kept his mind off the nightmares. Leela Mee took a job at the Red Cross Distribution Center handing out food and clothing to families who had lost everything. She recognized many of the faces. She gave them extra blankets when she could, and she never asked questions. She understood that some people needed more than just supplies. They needed kindness. Billy and Susie grew up in the shadow of the tornado. Billy became obsessed with weather. He would read every book he could find about storms, and he would draw diagrams of tornadoes, trying to understand how they worked. When he was 12, he built a homemade barometer out of a glass jar and a piece of rubber. He would sit on the porch during thunderstorms, counting the seconds between lightning and thunder, predicting the path of the storm. His teachers said he had a gift. His mother said he was just trying to control something that could not be controlled. Susie, on the other hand, refused to talk about storms. If someone mentioned the tornado, she would leave the room. She would go to her bedroom and close the door and not come out until she was sure the conversation was over. She never told anyone what she saw that day, not even her mother. She carried it inside her like a stone, heavy and cold. Years passed. The town of Altus rebuilt itself and the scars began to fade. New trees were planted along Main Street. The courthouse square was restored with a memorial garden dedicated to the 50 who died. The names were engraved on a granite slab, and every year on April 9th the town gathered there for a ceremony. They would release balloons into the sky, 50 of them, one for each life lost. The balloons drifted upward, carried by the wind, and people would watch them until they disappeared. It was a way of letting go, of sending something beautiful into the sky that had once brought so much destruction. Tom Harris lived to be 87 years old. He died in his sleep in the same house he had rebuilt after the tornado, on the same spot where his first house had stood. He never forgot the sound of the wind, but he learned to live with it. He would tell his grandchildren stories about the old days, about the dust storms and the drought, about the year the cotton crop failed and the bank almost took the farm. He would tell them about the tornado, but only if they asked. He did not want to frighten them. He wanted them to know that they came from people who did not give up, people who faced the worst and kept going. That was the legacy he left behind. Leela Mee passed away 2 years after Tom. She had a gentle death, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Susie was there, sitting by her bedside, holding her hand. Leela Mee looked at her daughter, now a grown woman with children of her own, and she smiled. She remembered the little girl who had clung to her leg, the little girl who had stopped speaking for a month after the storm, the little girl who had finally, slowly learned to laugh again. Leela Mee squeezed Susie's hand and whispered, "It's okay, I'm not afraid anymore," and she was gone. Susie stayed in Altus her whole life. She married a farmer named Roy, and they raised 3 children in a house just outside of town. She never watched the weather reports without feeling a knot in her stomach. She never let her children play outside when the sky turned green, but she also taught them about resilience. She told them the story of the tornado, not as a tale of horror, but as a tale of survival. She told them about the people who came together, the strangers who helped, the neighbors who shared what little they had. She told them that even in the darkest moments there was light, and she hoped that they would carry that lesson forward. The Altus tornado of 1947 is remembered today as one of the deadliest in Oklahoma history. It is studied by meteorologists and historians, discussed in weather conferences and community meetings, but for the people who lived through it, it is not a statistic. It is a memory. It is the sound of a freight train in the sky. It is the smell of wet earth and broken glass. It is the sight of a homemade sign that someone nailed to a tree after the storm, a sign that read, "We will rebuild." And they did. They rebuilt their homes, their schools, their churches. They rebuilt their lives, and they never forgot. The wind still blows through Altus, Oklahoma, carrying the scent of wheat and soil. The sky still turns green sometimes, and the sirens still wail. But the people are ready. They have built storm shelters and safe rooms. They have practiced drills. They have learned to respect the sky without living in fear of it. And when the storms come, they gather together just as they did in 1947 to face the wind and to hold on to each other. That is the story of the Altus tornado. It is a story of destruction, yes, but also of survival. It is a story of loss, but also of love. It is a story that belongs to the people of that small Oklahoma town, and it is a story that will be told for generations. Because some stories are too important to forget. Some stories are written in the wind and they echo through time, reminding us of who we are and what we can become. And when the sky darkens, when the air grows still, when the first hint of a funnel appears on the horizon, the people of Altus remember. They remember the day the world turned upside down. They remember the day they lost everything they had. And they remember the day they found out what they were made of. That is the legacy of the Altus tornado, and it lives on in every heart that calls that town home. But the story does not end there. The tornado of 1947 did not simply fade into the pages of history books. It left behind a legacy that would ripple through the decades, shaping not only the lives of those who survived, but also the way the entire nation understood and responded to severe weather. In the years after the storm, a young man named Billy Harris, the boy who had built a homemade barometer and sat on the porch counting seconds between thunder and lightning, grew up to become a meteorologist. He attended the University of Oklahoma, where he studied under some of the pioneers of modern storm science. He learned about the complex atmospheric conditions that breed tornadoes, the collision of warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico with dry, cold air from the Rockies, the wind shear that creates rotation, the invisible forces that can unleash such fury in a matter of minutes. But Billy never forgot the personal lesson of April 9, 1947. He knew that behind every tornado warning, behind every evacuated neighborhood, there were families like his own, ordinary people about to face the extraordinary. After graduating, Billy returned to Altus. He took a job with the local Weather Bureau office, the same one that had issued the warning for his hometown on that fateful day. The office was a modest building on the edge of town with a single radar dish that turned slowly, scanning the horizon for signs of trouble. Billy would spend hours studying the data, comparing the patterns of 1947 to the storms of today. He noticed something that disturbed him. The same kind of setup that produced the Altus tornado, a strong low-pressure system pulling up warm air from the south, was happening more frequently. The climate was changing and the storms were becoming more intense. Billy began to advocate for better warning systems. He wrote letters to state officials, attended conferences, gave speeches to community groups. He told them that the technology of the 1940s was no longer enough. The radar was old, the communication network was spotty, and there were still no sirens in many rural areas. He pushed for a network of storm spotters, trained volunteers who would go out into the fields and watch the sky, radioing in reports when they saw a funnel. He helped organize the first annual Tornado Preparedness Week in Altus, a week of drills and education that would later become a statewide tradition. But Billy's work was not just about technology. It was about memory. He wanted people to understand that the tornado was not a freak accident, not a punishment, not a random act of God. It was a natural phenomenon that could be understood, predicted, and survived. He wrote a book about the 1947 storm titled The Day the Wind Took Everything. It was part history, part science, part memoir. In it, he described the sound of the tornado as 100 freight trains, but also as something deeper, a roar that seemed to come from inside his own chest. He wrote about the dust, the darkness, the sensation of being lifted off his feet and thrown into a ditch. He wrote about finding his mother, Leela Mee, covered in debris but alive, and how that moment of relief was the most profound joy he had ever known. The book was published in 1972, 25 years after the storm. It sold modestly at first, but over time it became a classic of Oklahoma literature. It was used in schools to teach children about weather safety. It was quoted in scientific papers. And it was read by a new generation of storm chasers, those daring young men and women who would drive into the heart of the storm with cameras and radar equipment, hoping to capture the perfect shot of a tornado. Billy never approved of storm chasing for thrills. He believed it was dangerous and disrespectful to the people who had lost everything. But he understood the fascination. He had felt it himself as a boy, staring at the sky and wondering what made it so powerful. Meanwhile, Susie Harris, Billy's sister, had found her own way of dealing with the trauma. She had never spoken much about the tornado, but she had passed her fear and her strength to her children. Her oldest daughter, a girl named Emily, grew up hearing the story in fragments. She knew that her grandmother had lost her first home, that her uncle had become a famous meteorologist, that her mother had once been so afraid of storms that she would hide in the closet. But Emily was curious. She wanted to understand what her mother had seen, what had changed her so deeply. So one summer, when she was 16, Emily asked her mother to drive her to the old family homestead, the spot where the original house had stood. Susie hesitated. She had not visited that place in decades, but she agreed. They drove out of town, past the new subdivisions and the strip malls, until they reached a dirt road that led to an empty field. The land had been sold years ago, and now it was nothing but grass and weeds, but Susie knew exactly where the house had been. She pointed to a small depression in the ground where the foundation had been. Emily stood there, trying to imagine what it must have been like. She closed her eyes and felt the wind. It was a gentle breeze, warm and dry, nothing like the howling gale of that day, but she could almost hear it. Susie began to cry. She had not cried about the tornado since she was a child, but standing there with her daughter, the memories came flooding back. She remembered the sound of the glass breaking, the pressure in her ears, the sight of the wall collapsing. She remembered her mother's arms around her, the smell of dust and fear. And she realized that she had been carrying that moment inside her for over 30 years. It was time to let it go. Emily put her arm around her mother. They stood together in the field, the wind blowing through their hair. And then Susie told her daughter the whole story. She told her about the dark funnel that had appeared out of nowhere, the roar that felt like the end of the world, the debris that filled the air like hail from hell. She told her about the man she had seen running down the road, his clothes torn, his face bleeding, and how she had never known whether he survived. She told her about the silence after the storm, the strange quiet that had settled over the ruins, the sound of birds returning, the first stars appearing in a clearing sky. When she finished, Emily said nothing. She just held her mother tighter, and Susie felt something shift inside her, a weight lifting, a door opening. She was not healed. Some scars never fully heal. But she was no longer trapped in that moment. She could look back without the panic, without the cold stone in her chest. She could see the tornado for what it was, a terrible act of nature, and she could see her family for what they were, survivors. The 1947 Altus tornado also had a profound impact on the science of severe weather. In the years that followed, meteorologists studied the storm's track, its intensity, its unusual behavior. They discovered that the tornado had actually been part of a larger outbreak, a series of tornadoes that had swept across Texas and Oklahoma that same evening. One of those tornadoes had struck the town of Woodward, Oklahoma, just a few hours after Altus, killing over 100 people. The Woodward tornado became even more famous than the Altus one, but the two storms were connected by the same weather system. They were a reminder that tornadoes rarely travel alone, that when the conditions are right, they can spawn in clusters, unleashing devastation across a wide area. Scientists began to call this phenomenon a tornado outbreak. They developed a scale to measure the intensity of tornadoes, the Fujita scale, which was later updated to the enhanced Fujita scale. The Altus tornado was estimated to have been an F4, with winds between 207 and 260 miles per hour. That put it in the same category as the most violent tornadoes on record, those that level houses, toss cars like toys, and strip the bark from trees. The damage path was over a mile wide in some places, a scar on the land that could be seen from the air for years. The town of Altus became a case study in disaster response. Federal officials visited to document what had worked and what had failed. They noted that the warning system, though primitive, had saved lives. The radio broadcasts had reached many people, and the switchboard operator's diligence had alerted the town minutes before the tornado struck. But they also noted that many had ignored the warnings, believing that nothing could happen to them. That was a human failing, a natural tendency to assume the worst only happens to others. In the decades that followed, public education campaigns would emphasize the need to take warnings seriously, to have a plan, to seek shelter immediately. The legacy of the Altus tornado also extended to architecture and building codes. After the storm, the town required that all new homes be built with reinforced foundations and stronger roofs. Storm cellars became a standard feature in many new constructions. The old frame houses that had been so vulnerable were gradually replaced with brick and block structures. The new courthouse, built in the 1950s, had a designated shelter area in its basement, complete with supplies and first aid kits. And the schools, which had been destroyed, were rebuilt with safe rooms that could withstand even the most powerful winds. But perhaps the most lasting legacy was in the hearts of the people. The survivors of the Altus tornado did not just rebuild their homes. They rebuilt their community. They formed a disaster relief committee that would remain active for decades, ready to respond to any future crisis. They established a scholarship fund for children who had lost their parents in the storm, ensuring that education would not be denied to the next generation. They created a tradition of neighbor helping neighbor, of checking on the elderly during storms, of sharing supplies and offering shelter. That spirit became a part of the town's identity, a quiet resilience that was passed down from parent to child. As the decades passed, the memories began to fade. The children who had survived the storm became grandparents, then great-grandparents. The stories were told less frequently, and when they were told, they were polished, edited, softened by time. The horror was still there, but it was wrapped in nostalgia, in the warmth of survival. The tornado became a legend, a touchstone, a defining moment in the town's history. In 1997, on the 50th anniversary of the tornado, the town held a special commemoration. Billy Harris, now an old man, returned to give a speech. He stood at the podium in front of the memorial garden, the names of the 50 dead carved in stone behind him. He looked out at the crowd, hundreds of faces, some young, some old, some who had been there, some who had only heard the stories. He talked about the science of tornadoes, the importance of preparedness, the need to never forget. But he also talked about something else. He talked about love. He said, "When the tornado hit, I was just a boy. I didn't understand what was happening. I was terrified, but I looked at my mother and she was calm. She held my sister and me and she told us it would be okay. I believed her. I believed her because she was my mother, and that was what mothers did. They protected their children. And that love, that fierce, stubborn love, is what got us through. It is what got this town through. Love for each other, love for this place, love for the life we had built. That is the only thing stronger than the wind." The crowd applauded, some wept. After the ceremony, people lingered in the garden, touching the names on the slab, whispering prayers, leaving flowers. A young boy no more than 7 or 8 asked his grandfather what it was like. The old man who had lost his own father in the storm knelt down and looked the boy in the eye. He said, "It was loud, it was dark, but we survived, and that's what matters. We survived and we are still here." The boy nodded. He did not fully understand, but he would remember that moment. He would remember his grandfather's voice, the seriousness in his eyes, the weight of the story. And one day he would tell it to his own children and they would tell it to theirs. That is how the story lives on, not in books or on monuments, but in the quiet moments between generations, in the look that passes between grandparent and grandchild, in the memory of a sound that is both terrifying and sacred. Today, Altus is a different place. The town has grown, but it has not lost its character. The downtown still has the old storefronts, though many are now occupied by different businesses. The cotton fields are still there, stretching to the horizon, though they are now irrigated and more productive than ever. The wind still blows and the sky still turns green, but the people are prepared. They have shelters, they have sirens, they have a plan, and they have the memory of 1947, a memory that serves as both a warning and a promise. Every year on April 9th, the clock in the Methodist Church chimes at 6:32. The town stops for a moment, some bow their heads. Some look up at the sky, some just pause without knowing exactly why. The chime is soft, almost musical, but it carries a weight that is felt in the bones. It is the sound of time passing, of memory enduring, of a community that refuses to let go of its past. And so the story of the Altus Tornado continues. It is written in the wind, in the soil, in the hearts of the people who call that place home. It is a story of the worst day in the town's history, but also of the best. It is a story of death, but also of life. It is a story that will never truly end, because as long as the sky above Altus holds storms, as long as the wind blows and the clouds gather, the people will remember. And they will be ready. The chime that echoes from the Methodist Church every year on April 9th is more than just a memorial. It is a heartbeat, a pulse that reminds the living of the fragility of their days. For the children born in the decades since 1947, the tornado is a ghost story, a dark fairy tale that their parents tell on stormy nights. But for those who were there, it is a scar that never fully heals, a place in the mind where the sky still turns green and the wind still screams like a living thing. In the years following the commemoration, the town continued to evolve. The old cotton compress where so many had taken shelter and where so many had died was finally demolished in 20's ruin. It had sat empty for decades, a crumbling monument to tragedy, its walls stained with the memory of that night. Some wanted to preserve it as a museum, but the cost was too high and the pain was too fresh. So they tore it down, and in its place they built a small park with a gazebo and a plaque. The plaque lists the names of the dead, but it also includes a line that was added after much debate. Here, on April 9, 1947, the people of Altus showed the world what it means to be a community. The park is peaceful now. Children play on the swings while their parents sit on benches and watch the horizon. The grass is green and well-tended, and the flowers bloom in the spring. But sometimes, on a quiet afternoon, an older resident will stop and stare at the empty space where the compress used to stand. They will remember the smell of dust and blood, the sound of crying, the feel of splintered wood under their fingers. And they will shake their heads and walk away because some memories are too heavy to carry for long. The science of tornadoes has advanced dramatically since 1947. Doppler radar, first developed in the 1950s and refined over the following decades, now allows meteorologists to detect rotation within a storm before a tornado touches the ground. The National Weather Service issues warnings with lead times that were unimaginable in Billy Harris's childhood. In the old days, a tornado could be on top of a town before anyone knew it was coming. Today, the average warning time is around 13 minutes. Those 13 minutes can mean the difference between life and death, but even with all the technology, the human element remains. People still ignore warnings. They still wait too long. They still believe that it will not happen to them. That was the lesson of Altus, a lesson that every generation has to learn anew. The Fujita scale, which classified the Altus tornado as an F4, has been updated to the enhanced Fujita scale, which takes into account more detailed damage indicators. But the scale does not measure fear. It does not measure the sound of a mother's scream or the silence of a child who has stopped breathing. Scientists now understand that tornadoes like the one that hit Altus are often part of a larger pattern. They call it a tornado outbreak sequence, a period of several days during which a persistent weather pattern produces multiple rounds of severe storms. The outbreak of April 1947 was one of the deadliest in American history, with more than 160 people killed across Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. The storms that night were not random. They were spawned by the same powerful low-pressure system that had been moving across the plains for days, a system that meteorologists now recognize as a classic setup for violent tornadoes. In the decades since, researchers have studied that system in painstaking detail. They have reconstructed the atmospheric conditions using historical data, computer models, and the accounts of survivors. They have learned that the key ingredients were an unusually strong jet stream, a surge of moist air from the Gulf of Mexico, and a cap of warm, dry air that prevented the storms from developing until the energy had built up to explosive levels. When the cap broke, it broke violently. The result was a night of terror that stretched from the Texas Panhandle to the Great Lakes. The town of Altus has become a case study in another way as well. Sociologists have examined the response to the disaster, looking at how the community organized itself in the aftermath, how it dealt with grief, how it rebuilt. They found that the key to Altus's recovery was not the federal aid or the insurance money, though both were important. It was the social networks, the relationships between neighbors, the shared sense of identity. People helped each other not because they were told to, but because they had to. It was instinct, the same instinct that had driven mothers to throw themselves over their children during the storm. That instinct is still alive today. In 2013, when a massive tornado struck Moore, Oklahoma, killing 24 people and destroying thousands of homes, volunteers from Altus drove up to help. They brought food, water, and chainsaws. They brought blankets and first aid kits. But mostly they brought experience. They knew what it was like to wake up and find that your entire world had been erased. They knew how to offer comfort without words, how to just stand beside someone and let them cry. One of the volunteers was Billy Harris's daughter, Sarah, who had been born 2 years after the tornado. She told a reporter, "My father taught me that the only way to survive a disaster is to help someone else. That is what we do in Altus. That is what we have always done." The connection between Altus and Moore was not coincidental. Both towns were part of the same tornado culture, a culture shaped by the land and the sky. In Oklahoma, the wind is a constant companion. It carries the scent of wheat and diesel, of rain and dust. It is a force that can be gentle or merciless, and the people have learned to respect it. They build their houses with reinforced walls and anchors. They keep flashlights and batteries in a designated spot. They know the difference between a watch and a warning, and they pass that knowledge down to their children the same way they pass down recipes and lullabies. But there is something else that the people of Altus have passed down, something harder to define. It is a kind of toughness, a refusal to be broken. It is the knowledge that no matter how bad things get, you can always rebuild. You can always go on. That lesson was learned in the dark hours after the tornado, when the survivors emerged from their shelters and found a landscape of ruin. They did not sit down and weep, though many did weep. They did not give up, though giving up must have seemed tempting. They started to work, they cleared the rubble, they searched for the missing, they buried the dead, and then they built a new town, a better town, a town that would not be defeated by the wind. That lesson is still being taught. In the schools of Altus, students learn about the tornado every year. They watch documentaries. They hear from survivors if there are any left. They visit the memorial garden and read the names on the slab. They practice tornado drills, filing into the hallways and crouching with their hands over their heads. The drills are routine, almost boring, but the teachers make sure the students understand why they are doing it. They tell them about the night when the drill became real, when the sirens went off and the sky fell and nothing was ever the same again. One teacher, a woman named Margaret, has been doing this for 30 years. She was born in 1948, a year after the tornado. Her mother had been pregnant with her when the storm hit, had sheltered in a bathtub while the house shook around her. Margaret grew up hearing the story, and she has told it to countless students. She speaks of the storm with a kind of reverence, as if it were a living thing, a beast that had to be tamed. She tells them that the tornado was not evil. It was just nature, indifferent and powerful. The evil, if there was any, was in the human decisions that had left so many people unprepared. But the good, she says, the good was in the human response. The good was in the people who risked their lives to save strangers, who shared their food and water, who held hands in the dark. Margaret's students listen and they learn. Some of them will grow up to become engineers designing safer buildings. Some will become meteorologists predicting the next storm. Some will become nurses treating the injured. And some will become parents passing the story on to their own children. That is how the memory survives, not in a single act but in 1,000 small acts, 1,000 small moments of teaching and learning. The town has changed in other ways too. The old railroad depot, which had been destroyed by the tornado, was rebuilt and now serves as a museum. Inside, there are photographs of the destruction, yellowed newspapers with bold headlines, fragments of clothing and dishes that were found in the debris. There is a piece of wood with a nail driven through it, a reminder of how the wind can turn a simple nail into a deadly projectile. And there is a recording of a radio broadcast from that night, scratchy and faint, with the voice of a man urging people to take cover. Visitors stand and listen, their eyes fixed on the speaker, imagining what it must have been like to hear those words for the first time. The museum also has a section dedicated to the science of tornadoes. There are interactive displays showing how supercells form, how the rotation develops, how the funnel cloud descends. Children can press a button and see a simulation of a tornado on a screen. They can feel the vibration of the wind through the floor. It is a hands-on education and it is popular. But the most popular exhibit is the simplest. It is a map of the town from 1947 with the path of the tornado drawn in red. The red line cuts through the heart of Altus, a jagged scar that seems almost alive. Visitors trace it with their fingers, following the destruction, stopping at the spots where their own homes now stand. They look at the map and realize that they are living on ground that was once swept clean. In the summer of 2022, a team of researchers from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration visited Altus. They were conducting a study on the long-term effects of tornadoes on communities. They interviewed dozens of residents, asking about their memories, their fears, their hopes. They found that the tornado was still a presence in the town's collective psyche, even for those who had not been born when it happened. It was a reference point, a way of measuring time. People would say this house was built after the tornado, or that tree is older than the tornado. It was as if the storm had divided history into two eras, before and after. The researchers also found something unexpected. The people of Altus were not just resilient, they were optimistic. They believed that despite the tragedy, their town was a good place to live. They spoke of the kindness of their neighbors, the beauty of the plains, the freedom of open spaces. They did not dwell on the past, but they did not forget it either. They carried it with them, a quiet weight that made them stronger. One of the researchers, a young woman from New York, asked an elderly man why he stayed in Altus. He had lost his parents in the tornado when he was 6 years old. He had grown up in the town, had raised his children there, had buried his wife there. He could have left at any time. He had the money, he had the means, but he stayed. He looked at the researcher and said, "This is my home. The wind took a lot from me, but it did not take that. It cannot take that, because home is not a building. Home is the people, and the people are still here." The researcher wrote that quote down. She later included it in her report, and it became one of the most cited lines in the study. It captured something essential about the human response to disaster, something that no computer model could ever predict. It was the will to belong, the need to plant roots in a place, even if that place had been scarred by violence. As the years pass, the number of living survivors dwindles. The last verified survivor of the Altus tornado died in 2019 at the age of 92. Her name was Lucille Johnson. She had been 20 years old when the tornado struck, had sheltered in a ditch with her baby brother. She remembered the sound of the wind, the feeling of the ground shaking, the sight of a cow flying through the air. She remembered the silence afterward, broken only by the crying of the injured. She had told her story to anyone who would listen, and her story had been recorded for the Oral History Project at the local library. When she died, the town held a moment of silence at the memorial garden. The clock in the Methodist church chimed at 6:32, as it always does. But even as the survivors pass, the story does not end. It continues in the new families that move to Altus, drawn by the low cost of living and the quiet pace of life. They hear the story from their neighbors, from the museum, from the annual commemoration. They learn to look at the sky differently, to pay attention to the warnings. They learn to build shelters and stock supplies. They become part of the community, and the community becomes part of them. And so the story of the Altus tornado is not really about a storm. It is about a people. It is about the choice they made in the darkest hour of their history to keep going. It is about the way they turned destruction into creation, grief into love, fear into courage. It is a story that belongs not just to Altus, but to every town that has ever faced the wind. Because in the end, the wind does not care about names or dates. It does not care about boundaries or borders. It is a force of nature, indifferent and eternal. But the human spirit, the spirit that rebuilds and remembers, that holds each other close in the face of the storm, that spirit is something else entirely. It is the one thing that can never be blown away. And so, as the sun sets over the plains of Oklahoma, as the wind rustles the wheat and the clouds gather on the horizon, the people of Altus go about their lives. They tend their gardens. They watch their children play. They listen to the radio. They know that the sky can change in an instant, that the air can turn cold and heavy, that the green light can appear without warning. They know that the alarm may sound at any moment, that they may have to run to the shelter, that they may lose everything they own. But they also know that they will survive. They have survived before. They will survive again because they are the people of Altus and they carry the story in their blood. The story of the Altus tornado is written in the wind, in the soil, in the hearts of the people who call that place home. It is a story of the worst day in the town's history, but also of the best. It is a story of death, but also of life. It is a story that will never truly end, because as long as the sky above Altus holds storms, as long as the wind blows and the clouds gather, the people will remember, and they will be ready. Every year on the night of April 9th, the people of Altus gather in the memorial garden. The ceremony is simple. There are no speeches, no politicians, no cameras. Just the ringing of a bell, once for each life lost, and the soft glow of candles held by the townspeople. The children hold their candles carefully, cupping the flame with their hands, and the wind, so often a threat, becomes a gentle companion, flickering the wicks. The bell is an old iron one, salvaged from the Methodist church after the tornado. It was cracked in the destruction, but it still rings a bit off-key, and the people say that imperfection makes the sound more honest. In 2022, the ceremony marked the 75th anniversary of the storm. The town had planned a larger event with a historian and a special exhibit at the museum. But as the day approached, something shifted. The older survivors, those who still remembered, had mostly passed away. The children of survivors were now in their 60s and 70s. They decided that the best way to honor the day was to keep it small, to hold the same quiet vigil that their parents had started. So the bell rang 47 times, once for each of the dead, and the candles burned in the darkness. A young mother named Emily brought her 6-year-old son Lucas. She had grown up in Altus and had heard the story from her grandmother, who was 19 when the tornado came. Emily knelt beside Lucas and whispered the names of the people who died, reading them from a laminated card she had printed at home. Lucas listened, his eyes wide. He asked if the tornado would come again. Emily answered, "It might, but we will be ready, and you will know what to do." That is the heart of the story. It is not about fear, but about knowledge. It is not about the past, but about the future. The people of Altus have learned that memory is an act of love, a gift they give to the next generation. They teach their children how to read the sky, how to recognize the green tint, how to hear the change in the wind. They teach them to respect the power of nature without being paralyzed by it. And they teach them that after the storm there is always work to be done. There are neighbors to help, debris to clear, lives to rebuild. In the years since the tornado, the town has also become a place of pilgrimage for meteorologists and disaster researchers. They come to study the warning systems, the community response, the architectural lessons. They walk through the rebuilt neighborhoods and take note of the storm shelters, now required by law in every new home. They interview the residents, record their voices, and take their stories back to universities and government agencies. The lessons of Altus have been applied in towns across the plains, from Texas to Nebraska. The tornado of 1947 changed not just one community, but an entire region's approach to safety. But the most profound change is quiet, almost invisible. It is the way the people of Altus look at each other. They know that they share a bond, a deep and unspoken understanding. They have seen the worst and they have chosen to stay. They have chosen to trust each other. When a stranger moves to town, they are welcomed, but they are also watched carefully to see if they understand. Do they know where the shelter is? Do they have a plan? Do they know the story? If they do not, the neighbors will tell it gently over coffee or at the hardware store. They will tell it not to frighten but to include, because the story is the thread that weaves the town together. And so the story continues. It is told in the school, in the museum, in the garden, in the whispered conversations of parents tucking in their children. It is told in the way the town marks time, from the chime of the church clock to the ring of the cracked bell. It is told in the silence that falls each year on the anniversary, a silence that is not empty but full of memory. The Altus tornado of 1947 is no longer a breaking news headline. It is no longer a front-page story. But it is a story that lives, breathing and pulsing in the hearts of a people who refuse to let the wind take everything. They kept their home, their history, and their hope. And as long as the sky over Oklahoma holds the potential for fury, as long as the wheat bends in the breeze and the clouds build on the horizon, the people of Altus will be there, watching, remembering, and ready. That is the ending of this story, and it is also its beginning.